let's talk a little bit more about when does 62304 apply? What types of devices and like maybe where and when in development does it apply?
It starts from, really the beginning of the process, starting with your requirement generation and continues throughout the entire life cycle all the way to your formal testing or formal verification. As for what it applies to, medical devices, either in, a physical device such as a diagnostic device or a therapy device definitely applies. I think in terms of things that maybe aren't covered by 62304, these could be your maybe research use only devices, prototype things like that, that are you're really just trying to prove the technology, but there's no intention of having, a clinical trial or, that particular device making it to market.
So research use only sort of platforms, it doesn't apply. So I guess why would you not follow 62304 if you're developing a medical device? What have you seen in your experience at Keytech?
Sure. So I think it really comes down to timelines. The 62304 process, it does take time to work through. Also, early on in early prototype devices, maybe, you're pivoting in terms of technology, or you need to get something together quickly for a demonstration or something like that. That's really where I've seen the process be. I don't want to say the corners are cut, but just where things are eliminated and you kind of get into that reactionary mode on the software development side, where you're rapidly making changes and creating, kind of an internal architecture that maybe wasn't what you had intended to when you started the software development process.
Got it. So the risk there, if you're a startup company, is you're not following the 62304 prescribed process and framework. You're scrambling to get a functional prototype out the door, whether it's for an animal study or potentially maybe even a clinical trial if it's low enough risk. But what is the risk if you don't comply? Like what does it look like when you want to actually get into compliance to 62304 if you haven't?
If you haven't followed this process from the beginning, it can be kind of overwhelming to go back to the beginning. I mean, typically everyone has software requirements, but if you haven't kind of thought through a proper software architecture, you haven't classified your software, you haven't determined, what will apply at the 62304 level, you could find yourself in a little bit of a bind, trying to retroactively add, those process activities back in, and you have to kind of go through, you almost have to start from the beginning on some level to make sure that you've built in the quality that you want.
Got it. So that's a good segue, I think, into helping, right? I mean, that's what we do at Keytech, and what all product development firms are trying to do is trying to help our customers, you know, efficiently use our resources. And so, you coined this term of following the spirit of 62304, which to me is like entrepreneur speak for cheaper, but good quality software development to further along, a platform to whatever the next milestone is, but maybe not actually commercial. And so I guess just can you introduce to us what you mean by the spirit of 62304? And again, that's so what you're saying is let's go in and either re-architect something that already exists or starting from scratch, maybe not fully comply with the standard, but follow the spirit of it. What do you mean by that?
So really following the spirit means that, you're not required to follow 62304 with these research use only devices or early prototypes. But if you follow, kind of follow the spirit of 62304, or attempt to follow what makes sense for your current prototype, you can kind of allow yourself to kind of build the quality into your software and kind of build on a recognized standard, so that when you get to the next level and you want to, take this to a clinical trial or something like that, you've kind of already laid the groundwork. But at the same time, you can consider some portions of the standard, um, you know, y- not optional, but you can kind of shift where in time they take place. So by following the spirit, you can, get the higher quality software and have your groundwork for the regulatory agencies, but put off those activities that make sense to put off and that aren't required at the time to reach the level of quality that you're desiring.
That makes sense to me. It's similar to the argument of like on the hardware side where you 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 want to design a safe device, but maybe you're not doing full 60601 pre-screening testing to make sure that every last sort of mechanical or electrical sort of situation, that your product will survive. You just want to do kind of the bare minimum to make sure your product is ready for use in a clinical trial or by demonstration by end users. So I've seen and actually personally like run projects where you're kind of, I don't want to say shortcutting, but just following the spirit of a standard and testing what's most important. Sounds like similar, here. You mentioned requirements and architecture a few times now. Like what else are sort of the core elements of meeting the spirit?
Sure. Yeah. So obviously 62304 determines kind of the process that you need to follow, documentation, implementation standards, things like that. I guess specifically, it's really dependent on the classification of the software. As I mentioned before, class A is something that isn't necessarily safety critical, and class C being the highest level of safety criticality. It's really dependent on the level of concern of your software and the software classification per 62304. But generally speaking, you have to work through your requirements. After you have the requirements, you trace that to your software architecture document that outlines all of the architecture for Class C modules. You have to do a detailed design prior to implementation. We have all of our risk management documentation as part of 62304, managing your software risks and making sure any risk mitigations are getting into your software requirements. And then you have your formal implementation where you're implementing the architecture and requirements. And then at the end of the process, you're doing your formal verification, doing your unit tests, running code analysis tools, things like that on the software that you've developed, and then generating formal verification reports proving that the software has met the requirements defined.
I guess what are you not doing by following the spirit?
Sure. So
Maybe kind of
as
ask the question.
Yeah, so things like verification can be slid. It's really dependent on what your timelines are. You can do kind of functional checkouts and then say, okay, we're going to save our formal verification, maybe unit tests, things like that. You won't write as many unit tests as you need at the time. You can kind of shift out some of those to later to make sure you have the coverage metrics met that you've defined in your software development plan. Which I guess kind of circling back as part of the first step of the process is generating your software development plan that outlines how you're going to run the process, how you're going to meet if you're following 62304 normally, it defines what how you're meeting all of the standards. But in this case where you're kind of following the spirit, it gives you the freedom to kind of go through and line by line determine, okay, for this piece of software we're going to follow these elements of the standards, and these we're going to shift off until kind of the next prototype or the clinical trial unit or something like that.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, it's certainly test time. I can wrap my head around the time it takes to do, for example, unit testing and repeat testing. Document it all. What kind of time savings are you talking about here? Like roughly speaking. So let's say it's a an at home therapeutic device, and you're sprinting effectively to your first clinical trial, and you're following the spirit of 62304. It's clear that you're not going to harm a patient with this product. And so you don't need to do full 62304. Are you saving months here or a month? Or I guess give us a sense for the time savings.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the scope of the development, but I mean, I think you're definitely saving, upwards of months during that testing phase, and just kind of testing, in a way that makes sense for the goals of the device that you're working on, really.